In a world where the powerful manipulate everything, one man dared to take it all down. Kenny Harmon was once a silent ghost in the corporate machine, until betrayal, greed, and loss ignited his quest for revenge. But as he takes down the giants, who control the world, he realizes that revenge is just the beginning. What happens when one man decides to become the storm that destroys everything? Kenny Harmon had always believed that hard work would shield him from the chaos of corporate politics. For over 20 years, he had given his blood, sweat, and weekends to Highland Technologies, climbing the ladder from an obscure systems engineer to the trusted director of IT infrastructure. He was the man behind the curtain, the digital architect, of the company's sprawling global empire. To his subordinates, he was a leader who protected his team fiercely. To executives, he was a reliable fixer. He was the invisible backbone, until the day he became invisible for real. It was supposed to be a regular Monday. Kenny walked into the gleaming glass tower of Highland Technologies, clutching his favorite old thermos, a gift from his late wife, Sarah. He liked arriving early, when the building still whispered with the hum of overnight servers and the faint scent of fresh brewed coffee hung in the air. It was his moment of peace before the corporate grind kicked into overdrive. But today, the air felt different. The usually friendly security guard avoided eye contact as Kenny Badge scanned his way into the executive floor. The receptionist, always chatty about her weekend escapades, offered only a stiff nod. Kenny shook off the discomfort, attributing it to post-holiday sluggishness. Then he saw them. Dan Whitaker, the new COO, and Natalie Reeves, the recently promoted chief strategy officer, both sitting in his office. They didn't wait for him to sit down. "Kenny," Dan said coldly. "Close the door." A pit formed in Kenny's stomach. Natalie slid a glossy folder across his polished oak desk. Kenny's name was printed on the cover, along with the cold, sterile words, "Termination of employment, immediate effect." "What is this?" Kenny managed, his voice cracking under the weight of disbelief. Dan leaned back in Kenny's chair, like a king usurping a throne. "It's exactly what it says, Kenny. After careful review, the board has decided to move the IT infrastructure division in a different direction. We thank you for your service." Kenny's hands trembled. "This doesn't make sense. I built that division from scratch. You're moving it where, and who's replacing me?" Natalie folded her arms, her lips curling, into a rehearsed smile. "We've appointed Mark Dunham as the interim. He'll be reporting directly to me." Kenny blinked. Mark, his junior project manager? An arrogant, inexperienced bootlicker who barely knew how the legacy systems worked? "This is insane," Kenny said, standing now, his breath shallow. "Is this about the budget defense last quarter? I warned you about the server vulnerabilities if you kept cutting the—" Dan cut him off, his voice like ice. "This is not up for discussion, Kenny. You'll find a severance package inside. And, as per company policy, your system's access has already been revoked." It felt like the floor had disappeared beneath Kenny's feet. Revoked? That meant his emails, his files, his history. Erased, like he never existed. Natalie stood, brushing imaginary dust off her designer skirt. "Security will escort you out." The humiliation sank deeper. Kenny could feel the eyes of passing employees, some his protégés, watching as he was led out like a criminal. Whispers swirled in his wake. Outside, the winter air slapped his face, but it barely registered. His phone buzzed. It was disconnected. For the first time in 2 decades, Kenny Harmon was nobody. The days blurred into an endless haze of despair. Kenny holed up in his modest apartment, the silence suffocating. His daughter Emily, away at college, called every day, sensing something wrong. "Dad, what's going on? You sound off." He lied, saying he was just overwhelmed. But the truth was uglier. Without Highland, Kenny felt stripped of identity. He didn't know who he was outside the walls of that glass tower. But as the fog of depression settled, another, more dangerous emotion began to simmer beneath his grief. 3 weeks later, Kenny's old friend and former colleague, David Pike, called him to meet at a dingy bar downtown. David had left Highland a year ago, disgusted by the new regime. "I heard what they did to you, Kenny," David said, sliding him a whiskey. "Dirty bastards." Kenny nursed the drink, his hand still shaking. "They didn't just fire me, Dave. They erased me. It's like I never existed." David leaned in, his voice low. "You ever wonder why they picked Mark? Or why they pushed you out so fast?" Kenny frowned. "Because they wanted a yes man." David chuckled bitterly. "Partly, but there's more. Word is, Dan and Natalie are funneling certain infrastructure contracts to outside vendors. Overpriced contracts. Rumors of kickbacks, they needed you out of the way." Kenny's mind reeled. "But the board, wouldn't they notice?" David shook his head. "Dan's got the board wrapped around his finger. You were the last obstacle." The betrayal cut deeper than Kenny imagined. They hadn't just discarded him. They used him, gutted him, and now they were profiting off his life's work. For the first time in weeks, a dark clarity settled over Kenny. The helplessness began to transform into something sharper, purposeful. "Dave," Kenny said, his voice now steady, "I need access to my old files, backups, anything you might have kept." David hesitated. "That's risky, man. You go after them. They'll bury you deeper." Kenny smiled bitterly. "They already did. Now it's my turn." That night, Kenny opened his old laptop, the one they forgot to wipe when he was forced out. It still had encrypted backups of system logs, vendor lists, internal memos. He had kept them out of paranoia. Now it felt like destiny. For hours, Kenny dug into the files, piecing together the tangled web of shell companies, inflated invoices, and ghost contractors. The deeper he dug, the more sickening the truth became. Millions were being siphoned from Highland's IT budget into fake projects. And at the heart of it all was Natalie Reeves. But it wasn't just about the fraud anymore. It was about what they took from him. They stole his legacy, and Kenny Harmon was going to make them pay. Kenny knew he couldn't attack them head on. They had the power, the lawyers, the connections. He needed to be invisible, like a ghost haunting the digital corridors he once ruled. He spent days in isolation, researching, planning, setting traps. He reached out to old allies, carefully selecting those who still believed in integrity. He used burner accounts, encrypted chats, and the skills honed over 2 decades to stay under the radar. He knew every crack in Highland's cyber defenses because he built them. He knew every skeleton in their cloud archives because he buried them. But the most critical part of his plan required patience. They had stolen his dignity in public. He would destroy them in public. And when the dust settled, they would wish they had fired him like a man. But they chose humiliation. Now, they would learn the cost. The world had taken everything from Kenny Harmon. His career, his dignity, his purpose. But what the corporate wolves at Polaris Tech didn't know, what they would never understand, was that when you push a man into a corner, strip him of everything, you awaken something far more dangerous than a disgruntled employee. You see, awaken the man they buried, the man who built the empire from the ground up, and Kenny was done being silent. He spent the next 3 days in the shadows, barely sleeping, barely eating, fueled by pure rage and a thirst for retribution. The files David had given him weren't just proof of corruption. They were a map. Kenny pored over them, connecting the dots, drawing lines between emails, contracts, hidden accounts, and the smug faces of the people who had betrayed him. Gwen Sharp, Marlon Tate, and the shadow investors hiding behind foreign shells. They thought they were untouchable. They had no idea they'd created the perfect storm. Kenny's first move wasn't revenge, it was patience. He started by setting up an anonymous network of encrypted communications using his old underground contacts in the hacker community, people he'd trained, people who still respected him as the architect of Polaris Tech's digital fortress. He called himself Ghost Protocol. His message was simple. I'm not looking for chaos. I'm looking for justice, the kind the system won't give us. Within hours, his inbox flooded with replies from disillusioned tech professionals, whistleblowers, and security operatives who had seen companies like Polaris chew up and spit out their own. They wanted in. Kenny's plan unfolded like a chess game. First, he planted false anomalies inside the company's new AI-powered procurement system, a system Gwen Sharp had taken from his blueprints. The anomalies were subtle, designed to trigger minor procurement errors, causing invoices to be sent to incorrect vendors, payments to bounce, shipments to delay. It wasn't enough to bring the company down, but it was enough to embarrass them in front of their clients, and enough to get the attention of the board. Next, he used the data David gave him to craft a detailed dossier, a ticking time bomb that outlined the offshore accounts, the fraudulent vendor contracts, and the secret spin-off company Gwen had prepared to launch under the board's nose. He sent it anonymously to several investigative journalists specializing in corporate corruption. But he didn't release everything. Not yet. Kenny wanted them to squirm first. He wanted them to feel the paranoia, the cracks forming in their perfectly curated image. He wanted to watch them turn on each other. By the end of the first week, Polaris Tech Solutions was in chaos. Confidential emails leaked. Employees whispered about financial irregularities. Vendors demanded answers, and the board demanded blood. Gwen Sharp, once the company's rising star, found herself fighting fires from every direction. The media had caught wind of the offshore companies, and while she tried to spin the narrative as strategic partnerships, the damage was done. But Kenny wasn't satisfied with headlines. He wanted to tear them apart from the inside. Phase 3 of his plan was personal. He knew Marlon Tate's weakness, his vanity. Kenny hacked into Marlon's private server, exposing a trove of compromising data, illicit affairs, backdoor deals, falsified reports sent to shareholders. He leaked just enough to make Marlon sweat, but not enough to collapse the stock. Yet, he wanted Marlon desperate, paranoid, and most importantly, distracted. By the second week, Polaris Tech's executive floor turned into a battlefield. Lawsuits were filed. Board members demanded emergency meetings. The stock price dipped, then plummeted. Kenny watched it all from the shadows, savoring every collapse, every scramble, every press release dripping with fake damage control. But what they didn't know was that Kenny had saved the most devastating strike for last. It was a quiet Wednesday night when Kenny made his final move. Using the backdoor codes he had built into the company's server architecture years ago, hidden protocols no one else even knew existed, he triggered a silent data purge. Not of critical systems, not of customer data, but of Gwen's spin-off project. The entire infrastructure they had stolen from his work was erased in seconds, gone without a trace. Every blueprint, every line of code, every vendor contract, obliterated. Their secret empire crumbled before it could launch, and Kenny made sure the forensic trail led straight to Gwen's private server, implicating her in the catastrophic breach. She would take the fall, publicly, completely. By the next morning, Polaris Tech Solutions was a sinking ship. News of the breach hit the headlines like a nuclear bomb. Shareholders revolted. The board ousted Marlon Tate. Gwen Sharp was paraded in handcuffs on the evening news, accused of embezzlement, fraud, and corporate espionage. And Kenny? He sat in a quiet bar downtown, sipping his whiskey, watching the chaos unfold on the TV above the bar. The world would never know his name, but he didn't need the credit. He had dismantled the empire that tried to bury him, and in doing so, he had awakened something in himself he thought was long dead. Freedom, control, power. But Kenny wasn't done. Because now that he had nothing left to lose, he realized he could become something more than an employee. He could become a force, a legend. Ghost, Kenny Harmon had won, but victory tasted hollow. He'd torn down Polaris Tech Solutions. He had brought Gwen Sharp, Marlon Tate, and the entire board to their knees. He had exposed them to the world, stripped them of their power, and made them watch as their empire crumbled. Yet as he sat alone in his apartment, surrounded by the silence of his triumph, Kenny realized something terrifying. Revenge wasn't enough. Polaris Tech had been just one head of a monstrous hydra, a global network of greed, corruption, and exploitation. There were 1,000 more companies, 1,000 more Gwen Sharps hiding behind polished brands and fake philanthropy, bleeding the world dry. Kenny had seen the beast. Now he knew what he was meant to be. Not just a ghost in their system, but a storm. 2 months later, Kenny had vanished from the grid. No home, no records, no bank accounts, but whispers of his new identity flooded the dark corners of the internet. Hackers, whistleblowers, and digital vigilantes spoke of the Ghost Protocol Network, a decentralized, anonymous movement built by Kenny Harmon. He had recruited them one by one: disillusioned coders, cybersecurity analysts, former intelligence officers, ethical hackers who had been silenced by corporate power, and they had a mission: to burn the old world down and build a new one in its place. Their first target was Bastion Industries, an international conglomerate known for environmental atrocities masked behind greenwashing campaigns. Kenny's team infiltrated their systems, leaked confidential emails exposing toxic waste dumping, bribed regulators, and fake sustainability reports. The fallout was nuclear. Governments launched investigations. CEOs resigned. The stock imploded. But Kenny didn't stop there. He moved like a phantom through the digital corridors of corporate power, dismantling human trafficking networks disguised as tech firms, exposing pharmaceutical companies hoarding life-saving patents, crashing private equity firms preying on vulnerable communities. Each strike was bigger, bolder, more brutal. But the world started to notice. Governments branded him a terrorist. Corporations offered millions in bounties for his head. Interpol, the CIA, the NSA, everyone wanted Kenny Harmon. They wanted the ghost. But they couldn't catch what they couldn't see. Kenny lived inside the system now. He had become the code. But power always comes at a price. Kenny's network grew so fast, so widespread that paranoia crept into its foundations. He began to suspect moles, double agents, whispers of betrayal, and in the shadows, a new enemy emerged: Black Sun, a covert syndicate of global billionaires, mercenaries, and rogue AI developers, created for one purpose only: to hunt down and eliminate the Ghost Protocol Network. They had one goal: erase Kenny Harmon from existence. And they almost succeeded. The attack came on a rain-drenched night in Istanbul. Kenny was hosting a covert meeting with his inner circle inside an abandoned Ottoman-era vault when the first EMP drones blacked out the city grid. Seconds later, Black Sun operatives breached the vault, guns blazing. Kenny's team fought like hell, but they were outgunned, outnumbered. By dawn, half his network was gone, dead, vanished, his secure servers destroyed, his war room reduced to ashes. Kenny barely escaped, wounded, broken, bleeding into the Bosphorus as Istanbul burned behind him. For the first time in months, Kenny faced a question he thought he had buried. Was this worth it? He looked at the world he had tried to save. It didn't want saving. It wanted entertainment. The masses didn't care who ruled them, as long as their feeds stayed full and their dopamine drip stayed steady. Kenny Harmon was fighting a battle against a world that had already surrendered. But as he drifted in the cold waters, clutching the encrypted drive he had managed to salvage, he realized something deeper. This wasn't about saving the world anymore. It was about forcing it to wake up. One act of fire, one scream of defiance, even if it killed him. Weeks later, the world was watching the Global Economic Forum in Geneva, a stage where billionaires and presidents paraded fake unity while tightening their grip on humanity. The event was broadcast live to billions, and that's when Kenny made his final move. Using the last of his fractured network, he hijacked the event's entire digital infrastructure. The giant LED screens behind the speakers flickered, the broadcast cut to static, and then Kenny Harmon's face appeared, scarred, cold, defiant. His voice echoed across the world. You have built your empires on our backs. You have poisoned the air, the water, the minds of our children. You have lied, stolen, killed, and you thought you were untouchable. You thought the world would never wake up. But today, I am the reckoning you can't silence. Today the world will see you for what you are. Today I burn it all down. And with a single command, he unleashed the Black Dawn virus, an unstoppable, self-replicating algorithm designed to erase every offshore account, crash every data vault, obliterate every digital shadow of the elite's stolen wealth. It wasn't about money, it was about chaos, about stripping them of the digital armor they had hidden behind for decades. The virus surged through global networks like wildfire. Banks collapsed. Stock markets froze. Cryptocurrencies vaporized. The financial world was thrown into darkness, and as the global stage descended into screams, Kenny sat in a safe house deep in the Siberian tundra, watching the world burn, smiling. He knew they would hunt him forever. He knew he would die a villain in their history books. But he didn't care, because Kenny Harmon was never fighting for applause. He was fighting for the broken, the voiceless, the invisible. And he knew that even if they never knew his name, they would feel his roar in every shattered screen, in every toppled empire. The world would rebuild, or it would perish. But they would never forget. The ghost.